Okay, hello everyone. I would like to start. Welcome back from the coffee break, although at this conference I feel we don't really need the coffee to stay awake at the lectures. So I would like to present the first speaker for this session. Christian Tulin is Associate Professor at the Semiotics School of Communication and Culture in Aarhus University. And he is working on cognitive science of language, and today he will be talking about carving language for cognition and interaction.
Yes, first, thank you to the organizers for this lovely opportunity to share some of the work that we have been doing for the last couple of years. I'm going to use language in a very broad sense, and you'll see why. But for instance, I'm going to spend some of my talk talking about these things up here, and I'll come back to what they are. But let's first kind of wind back to one of these discussions that tend to come up in discussing language evolution. That is this kind of ambiguity between language being like a biological or kind of a cultural phenomenon. And I guess it is captured quite well by a paper by my friend and collaborator, Morten Christiansen and Nick Tjeder, where they kind of portrayed in this way. So we could either imagine a situation where language is posing like pressures on biology, and that is how we get a biological system that's observed language. And that's I guess one of the suggestions, right, that we will find in universal grammar, for instance, or the ideas presented by Noam Chomsky, among others. And the kind of predictions that come out of that would be that we develop language-specific cognitive repertoires or biological underpins of language, so to speak. And an alternative view that is often presented is the idea that biology poses some pressures on language, right? That we are equipped with biological, cognitive and biological architecture that present some constraints on language. These are domain general cognitive processes, right? And language evolves to fit into the existing human brain. What I'm presenting today will not kind of help us decide where we are on the continuum between these kind of two, and probably, as I allude to here in the in the headline, there's some kind of dynamical systems thing going on here, where we have feedback between these two things. However, the way that we could approach some kind of inform these discussions, right, is by looking at data, and it's difficult because mostly when we have access to cross-sectional data, it's not really clear what kind of underlying mechanisms give rise to those data, and that's where an experimental approach could be helpful, right? So cross-sectional data often lend itself to several interpretations in terms of the underlying mechanisms, but sometimes we can construct experiments where we explicitly manipulate parameters and that can lead to that, for which we have predictions, right? So we can kind of decide that if we observe a particular phenomenon, it must be because there is this particular causal mechanism. So the strength of the experimental approach, and we can come back to all the weaknesses later on maybe, is that we can ask, can a particular mechanism give rise to a particular phenomenon? So when we observe languages evolve in a particular way, right, could that be due to, let's say a particular mechanism? That's what I'm going to talk about mostly. And I guess I mentioned the kind of cognitive constraints that work on language, right? And in a number of studies, we have looked also how various kind of ecological and like contextual, environmental properties could possibly also kind of contribute to continuously shaping language. Just to get us started with what it means to conduct these kind of experiments, I'm just going to give a an example of very briefly of an experiment that we conducted recently. This one here. And here, what we are doing is we are creating kind of an artificial situation in the lab, and we are trying to simulate what supposedly could be going on over, of course, many generations, in principle, over a course of thousands of years, right? In this particular case, the kind of toy language that we played around with was, here we actually used natural language, but the kind of toy situation was one where one person is giving directions to another person by explaining a route on a map. So imagine that we have a participant that has a map, there's some landmarks on it, and there's another participant who has the same landmarks, but a route drawn on the map. And now the recipient here draws the same, the task of the recipient is to draw the same route on her map based on the instructions that she gets from the director. What we can do then afterwards is we can look at how successful were those instructions. So this could be the kind of route, and now we have a participant that tries to draw that route only from the instructions, right? And we see here that there's a certain amount of error, so we can overlay those two routes and we can calculate the error, and we can, from that, we can kind of get an idea about how successful was the event of communication in this particular case. It might be that there's another participant that are better at giving instructions, and the resulting route is this one, and here we have a very little error, right? So we can kind of look at what at moments of successful and less successful communication, so to speak. What we did in this particular case was that we took this task, which has been used before in experiments, and we inserted it into kind of a game of telephones, if you know this game. So we would have participant A here who communicate a particular map to participant B. The participant B draws that map. Then participant B gets a new map and has to give instructions to participant C. And participant C gets a new map and has to give instructions to participant D, and so on and so forth, through what we often refer to, using this particular experimental technique, we observe to participants as generations, because we are kind of trying to simulate what goes on when a certain practice is kind of passed on from generation to generation, and what kind of changes happen to that practice. Then we also had two conditions. We had a condition where the recipient could not ask any questions, but would have to just read the instructions. This was actually done in a chat tool. And we had another condition where there was bidirectional interaction. And what we observed using this technique here was that, interestingly, over generations, that is, as an effect of this repeated transmission, the route descriptions became better and better. That is, participants were able to more precisely give instructions, right, for the next participant, allowing the participant to make a more precise route, which is kind of interesting. We also got a main effect of whether the communication was uni or bidirectional. I won't comment in any detail on that. But what seems to be happening here is that those particular expressions that work well tend to be reused in the next generation by the participants when they have to suddenly become the director and give directions on a new map. And those strategies for giving directions that did not really work out, that ended up being ambiguous for you as a listener, those you would not reuse again. So we have something akin to what Mark was talking about earlier today, where the more kind of effective strategies seem to be passed on and reused, and those that are not super effective are not. So in summary here, we see that the route descriptions become better over our generations, and that seems to be because participants, they reuse effective route-giving strategies and dismiss non-effective ones. I think the interesting thing here to take notice of is that this effect is carried by language itself. So all participants are only giving instructions once in this game, right? So any improvement is not really due to any particular participant learning something or becoming better and more skilled. Rather, we can think about language here as some kind of like cultural technology that is being refined and passed on, not maybe totally unsimilar to the way in which instrumental technologies are continuously refined and passed on and refined and passed on and so on and so forth. So, as I was mentioning, we've done a lot of these kind of experiments here, both using natural language, also some where we use other kind of toy languages. For instance, asking our participants only to use gesture and then observing how they conventionalize certain means of communicating with each other, giving a certain kind of communication challenge. However, concern could be presented that in these kind of experiments, like we observe effects happening over the course of 45 minutes, right? And are we really kind of tapping into the same mechanisms that possibly could be driving something like language evolution going on, of course, on a totally different time scale? And it can be hard sometimes to really bridge between different types of evidence in this case. And that's why we recently hooked up with some colleagues from archaeology, and we thought, could it be that we can kind of just get one small step closer to the actual data that sometimes inform our discussions about language evolution? So I'd like to spend the rest of my paper on this very new study. It actually came out on Wednesday in the preceding week here. So it's really new baked material. And here we study a particular phenomenon that it's some artifacts that were excavated during the last 15 to 20 years in two sites in South Africa, the Diepkloof rock shelter, where they found these guys over here. These are engravings made on ostrich eggshells, and these patterns here, they are from the Blombers Cave. Some of you may have heard about the Blombers Cave, and are engravings made on ochre, so ochre stone. And the interesting thing here, the really particular thing about this finding is that these items were found through different stratigraphic layers in these two sites, and dated to different times. The oldest ones are approximately 100,000 years old, while the most, like the youngest ones, are something like 60,000 years old. And together, these are considered among some of the earliest evidence we have of symbolic behavior, like really early symbolic behavior. And if we kind of line up some of the outlines of these patterns, we see that over this period of approximately 40,000 years, things are happening to these patterns that have been engraved here. So here are the early ones, and here are the later ones. This is from Blombers, and here are the Diepkloof ones. We see that they kind of evolve from being very kind of simple parallel marks, right, to become more complex, and in the end also more symmetrical and more ordered. And our suggestion here, or the kind of hypothesis that we will be pursuing, is that over time, these guys here, they kind of evolve to become better symbols. So in a similar way where like instrumental technologies and tools evolve by these kind of incremental refinements over time to become more effective for their particular function, these patterns might also have evolved in a similar fashion to become more effective symbols, that is, kind of tools of the mind. However, the concept symbol here is super ambiguous, right? It's often used as some umbrella term to mean very different things. However, in this particular case, there's been kind of an ongoing discussion in the field. A lot of speculations about what could possibly have been the symbolic function of these guys. That is, these these engravings here. And in a set of papers, one anthropologist here has suggested over and over again that these marks are probably just pure forms. That is, they have been created with an aesthetic intention as kind of decorations, or what we could think of as maybe proto-art. While other people have been slightly more bold and said, oh, probably these patterns could have functioned to signify something like group identity. So there might have been different styles that you would recognize, so that when you see a pattern, you would say, oh, that's probably coming from the Blumbers, or that's probably coming from Diekloop or someone else. The concept of style is a little bit ambiguous also. There's sometimes we distinguish passive style, which can actually emerge just by random drift over time. So by pure reproduction, we do seem to have some kind of style elements that stabilize, which makes it possible for the perceiver to see that, oh, this pattern probably comes from this particular group. But we also sometimes see something like active style, where you intentionally, explicitly produce a pattern in order to communicate your association with the group. Last but not least, there are actually a number of papers that have speculated that here we actually see something like that we should regard as a very early form of denotational communication. That is, that every one of these engraved signs here could refer to some kind of semantic meaning. One meaning water, one meaning deer, something like that. So what we are actually looking at here is a very early example of an arbitrary sign system. Now, how can we progress in this discussion, right? So most of these speculations here are based purely on like analysis of the artifacts alone, right? What we are suggesting is that we could here take an experimental approach and ask. So we see this kind of change of the patterns over time, and maybe that these particular changes contain some information about what kind of adaptive pressures has been working on these patterns here. So what we ask in this set of studies that I'm going to present is what are the cognitive consequences of these changes, and can they inform us about the possible function? Now, these items are very unfit for the kind of standard cognitive science experiment, because they are so varied, and they are in complexity and in the length of lines, number of lines. So what we did was we took the original outlines, published outlines from various kind of scientific journals, and then we made a stimulus set where we still try to sustain the compositional elements, how lines intersect and so on and so forth, but still we try to make it a little more controlled by controlling a number of and length of individual lines. And this is the type of stimuli that we use in our experiments. And let's start by the first hypothesis, if we can talk about that. That is the first suggested function, right? So if these patterns, if they are intentionally created to induce some kind of aesthetic effect, then we would imagine that over time they would probably evolve to become more salient to the visual system, and maybe also recognized as intentionally made by humans. And in order to test that particular hypothesis, we used a technique called continuous flash suppression. And there you take and bombard the one visual field with really vivid colors, and then you present the patterns to the other visual field using a mirror stereoscope, so that pass up the visual display to the two eyes. What happens then is that the experience is at first totally overridden by the colors, and you are unable to see anything but colors. But at a certain time, a peak shift effect happens, and suddenly the stimulus here would kind of break into conscious perception. And it has been shown in other experiments that that variable time, what is something that's called the time to emerge, is proportional to the salience of the percept. So if you have a very salient stimuli, for instance, someone staring right at you, then you'll be able to see it. It will break through to conscious perception faster than if you, for instance, see a profile of the same face. And we use this technique with all the stimuli from early and later parts of the period here. In order to investigate whether they also evolved to become more intentional, we just showed all the possible kind of combination of pairs and asked people to indicate which of two items here they perceived as more likely to have been produced by a human. Then there was another hypothesis, right? Could these have been kind of carrying information about group identity? The prediction there is that if they did, then probably they would evolve to become more easier for our memory system to kind of hold in working memory and easier to reproduce. And maybe also they would become more similar in style within each of the two archaeological sites here. So the Blombos ones would become more similar in style, which would make it easier to recognize a pattern as coming from either one or the other cave. In order to investigate that, we made this reproduction task. You would see a pattern. It would disappear from the screen for a few seconds, and then you're asked to reproduce it by pulling in lines, rotating them, placing them, and something like this, right? And that allowed us to take the original here, take the copy that the participant made, compare them, and then calculate the error, just a bit like we did with the map task a moment ago. Also, we had a task where people were shown a target and two competitors, and then they would ask to indicate if this pattern here would be from the same cave as this one or this one. And they just, again, we presented all the pairwise combination of the patterns here. In the end, we were interested in whether these could have worked as full-blown referential symbols. And we predicted that if that was the case, probably they would also evolve to become more discriminable even within sight. The reasoning being that if a sign system should work effectively, then it is where each sign is denoting its own individual meaning, then it's important, of course, that we can easily separate the signs, and therefore we might observe them to become more separate, easier to separate. And here we used a reaction time task. We showed again a target and two competitors, and asked our participant as fast as possible to point to which one of the competitors here would be similar to the target. And we also sometimes rotated these guys in order to make it a little bit more difficult. Let's have a look at some of the results here. So the first experiment was the one where we looked at visual saliency, and we do see actually that the time to emerge, the time that it takes for a pattern to break into conscious visual perception, actually decreased when we get to the more recent or the late patterns compared to the early ones. So the patterns that were made only 60,000 years ago seems to be more salient than the ones that are older. In terms of experiment 2, we see a quite strong effect suggesting that the late patterns are recognized as more likely being made by humans, so we recognize some kind of element of human intentionality here. In the experiment 3, we observe that the error, the fidelity or reproduction error over time decrease. That is, it becomes easier to reproduce the patterns that you see from memory. We also observe here that it becomes easier to recognize a pattern as belonging to one of the two sites over time. So with the later, with the later patterns, that is easier to guess correctly that it comes or belongs together with other patterns from that same site. However, when we get to the discriminability, we don't have any kind of particular evidence that it becomes easier to discriminate these patterns both between the two sites and actually patterns originating within the same site. So let's just have a brief look at a brief summary here. So the engravings, they seem to have evolved to become more effective, kind of tapping into our cognitive systems in more effective ways over time by or through some kind of cumulative refinements of the forms here. Also, in terms of the kind of the function, there's definitely support for the idea that they could have served as aesthetic symbols or aesthetic forms, maybe as decorations or some kind of proto-art. But also, since they kind of become easier to remember and reproduce, and since we do seem to see some kind of element of style emerging over the course of the development here, they could perhaps also have served to signify group identity. When we are a little bit kind of hesitating here, it's because the discriminability, even between sites, did not become better over time. So it might be that we are observing kind of an element of passive more than active style, so that they do get kind of aspect of style that make it possible to recognize them as belonging to a particular site, but we don't have good grounds to say that they were explicitly, intentionally used to communicate group identity or something like that. We do not really get any direct support for the idea that the engravings served as denotational symbols. So you could say that it's a bit ironic. I was invited to talk about language evolution, and maybe actually the conclusion here is that these particular guys probably did not work as verbal language does, as denotational signs. However, they are still kind of maybe kind of a stepping stone. It's a kind of a form of very early symbolic behavior. So this is the kind of stuff that we published this week, and now we are kind of following up, asking, so can we... oh, we're actually done. Okay, good. Perfect. I was going to talk about a study where we use these kind of methods, transition chain methods to look at these, if we can kind of simulate the same process in the lab, but that's not so important. I'll actually come back on Evolang and talk about that, so if any of you will attend the conference Evolution of Language in Brussels later this spring, you can catch up on this story. Here's acknowledgements, all my collaborators. Thank you.
So we have time for 1 or 2 questions. Anyone?
Turn the light on.
So before I ask, I want a guarantee of co-authorship on the study I'm going to suggest.
You got it.
Some of this is well known, but probably not much published on the evolution of writing systems. So if you look at the 2 examples that are well known are cuneiform and Chinese, where in each case we have a long history and we can trace the evolution of the system. And in each case they become more organized and more arbitrary over time, and it's very, very easy to trace, though I don't think that anybody has actually done the study, but it looks like you might be able to.
Yeah, I think Oliver Morin is doing something of that sort, taking different writing systems and look like systematically how they evolved in respect to certain kind of cognitive affordances. But yeah, so that's some studies that I know about, and I think also that he looks into very many different writing systems. So probably, yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. One more question.
How can you distinguish between 2 alternative possibilities to interpret the data that you showed at the very end. That as time progresses, the figures become more interpretable, etc. One possibility is that indeed the arts is progressing or evolving in some objective sense. Another is that it simply becomes more similar to the way we perceive things because time progresses. And had you shown that to somebody from the deep past, they would have reported exactly on the opposite.
Yes, so that's, of course, here we can only study this phenomenon very indirectly, and I think it was noted this morning that the larynx is not really kind of fossilizing, and of course, all the kind of stuff that we tap into here is those aspects of symbolic behavior that is not fossilizing, right? That the whole kind of cognitive processes, the process like related to this behavior here. However, I guess my answer would be twofold, right? Nothing have stopped people until now speculating wildly about the function of these things without any kind of data beyond just looking at these. So we're trying to kind of provide some grounds to kind of get a little step forward here. It's still a very indirect measure, just as any kind of analysis of brain casts, or genetics will be. The second answer is that one kind of strength here is that, in some sense, we are within participant studying the consequences of these changes, right? So you could say we are somehow holding the cognitive, any kind of development that our cognitive systems would be subject to, holding that constant and then looking at what are the kind of consequences of the formal changes of the patterns over time, holding constant for time being any evolution any aspect of the evolution of the cognitive system. And that's, I guess, what we can do for now. I definitely do acknowledge that a lot of concerns could be brought up in terms of using modern participants with all their kind of experiences of other communicative practices and so on and so forth, right? But for now, I hope that we can inform discussions a little bit better than, or with some kind of data, right, that discussions that are already going on.
Thank you. Okay, so now our next speaker is Yoav Ram from IDC Herzliya. And he is actually a very good example of exactly what Tzachi was talking about in the beginning of the conference. So he is a mathematician and a computer scientist who is studying evolutionary biology and ecology and also cultural evolution. And he will be talking about some apples and trees, I think.
Hi. My name is Yoav. I'm from IDC Herzliya, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about our work on the evolution of non-vertical cultural transmission. So this is work done with Mark Feldman from Stanford and Uri Lieberman from Tel Aviv, and some of it also with Lee Altenberg from Hawaii, and with the support from these agencies. So I'm mainly interested in the processes that generate and transmit both genetic and phenotypic variation. And about this, basically this trade-off that Darwin talked about. He said some authors believe it to be as much the function of the reproductive system to produce individual differences as to make the child like its parents. So he said, it's not something he says, right? It's some other authors believe it. But the focus here is about this trade-off between making individual differences introducing new variation, and making the child like its parents. And there's a reason to make the child like its parents, because the parents had had children. So you want to be like your parents. But if everybody only make their child like themselves, then there's no material for adaptation. Now, in genetic transmission, which is what we usually think about in evolutionary biology, variation is transmitted from parents to offspring. So genetic transmission is inherently vertical, from parent to offspring. However, in cultural transmission, and here I'm thinking about cultural traits like language, but also norms, ideas, technologies, practices. These things can be transmitted not only from parents to offspring, but also from kin, non-kin, norms, peers, from offspring to other offspring, and even go back from offspring to parents. So this is inherently vertical, whereas this can be non-vertical in many, many cases. And one example is, for example, a teacher teaching a class, right? And which is done through language and through verbal communication. And this is usually not vertical, because most of these children are not his children. So I'm going to concentrate just on vertical and oblique transmission, where vertical, like I said, from parents to offspring, but oblique transmission is defined as offspring inheriting traits from non-parental adults. Right? So this is the case that this lady says, place it between middle finger and thumb, right? And so she's instructing her how to use the chopsticks. So this is oblique transmission. And this is not unique to humans. It's also been found in many cases in animals. For example, in humpback whales, this is Boston and Cape Cod Bay. All of the markers here are whale sightings. Every time a ship goes out to whale sightings, they also mark in the log everything that happens. And this shows us along the years the proportion of whales using this unique behavior called lobtail feeding. The whale smacks the water and then dives down to feed on the fish. And presumably maybe smacking the water prevents the fish from running or something like that. And you can see that over time, the proportion of individuals doing lobtail feeding has increased. So they analyzed this data using social network data from whales. So they also have social networks, not just us, of course. And this is a really nice method called diffusion analysis. And what they figured out is that learning of lobtail feeding was mostly done from non-parental adults. And this is despite the fact that whale cubs live with their mothers for a long time. So this is, I think, a very nice example that oblique transmission occurs in other animals as well. So the model that I'm going to describe, because all of my work is theoretical, the model that I'm going to describe has two phenotypes that affect fitness. Two phenotypes, A and B. For example, hunter and gatherer. Right? So if my father was a hunter, there's a good chance I'll also be a hunter, because he can teach me how to shoot arrows, he can give me his bow, he can let me know where the best game is. But maybe I'm already used to eating meat. I'm used to I've got the microbiome of a meat eater. But maybe for some reason I didn't learn from my father. Instead, I learned from some other adult, and maybe that adult was a gatherer. So now I'm learning about which berries are best and which mushrooms to avoid and when is mango season. You could also think about the two traits as something else, right? Like we heard earlier from Mark, I think, about code free and code less. So this could also be the two traits, right? Using free or less. So I'm not really thinking specifically about one trait, but very generally. Also, I want to make sure that when I say fitness, we're on the same page. I'm not thinking about the fitness of the trait. I'm thinking about the fitness of the individual. So I'm talking about expected number of offspring or something like that. I'm talking about biological fitness, not some cultural fitness of the trait or something like that. So I'm very close to the ecological evolutionary meaning. Okay, so this is the idea. How does transmission occur? We have a parent, an offspring. What is the probability that the offspring will inherit her mother's trait, in this case blue? We mark that probability with rho. Otherwise, she will inherit some other adult trait, and then that will depend on the frequency of the trait in the population. So this rho is the vertical transmission rate, the rate at which the population uses vertical rather than non-vertical transmission. How does the model look like? So this is the frequency of trait A in the next generation. So basically, if I pick up a random offspring, what is the probability that it has phenotype A? So if that offspring used vertical transmission with probability rho, the probability that it has A, we need an A adult. So X is the frequency of A in the adult generation, and we need that adult to become a parent. So that's the relative fitness of A over the relative to the mean. Otherwise, maybe the offspring used non-vertical, or in this case, oblique transmission, so it's 1 minus rho, and in that case, it needs to pick a random adult role model, and the probability that that role model is A is, again, X, the frequency of A in the current generation. So this is the kind of models that are frequently used in evolutionary biology, and we saw earlier today Martin show a similar type of equation. We also looked at a changing environment, so we assume that fitness changes over time. The idea is that some years it's better to be a hunter, there's lots of game. Some years, not so much game, so you're better off being a gatherer, right? So we mark that with K and B and L, so A is preferred for K generations, and then B for L generations. So we can be something like AAA, BB, AAA, BB. Okay. So that's the setup, that's the model. First thing we wanted to see is how oblique transmission affects protected polymorphism. That's the name we call in ecology when we have coexistence of the two traits over a very, very long time. So it's a stable case where we have the two traits co-occurring, neither of them goes extinct. Right, this is the more formal. Okay, so what we find is that oblique transmission increases the parameter space in which a polymorphism can be stable. What you see here is the vertical transmission rate, so this is mostly oblique, mostly vertical, and here is the ratio of environmental periods, that's the asymmetry. How much more is B favored over A? So is it A, B, A, B, A, B, A, B, A, B, or is it A, B, 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 B? Many generations favoring phenotype B. So in the blue, it's polymorphism. That means that the polymorphism exists and can be maintained for a very long time. And we see that oblique transmission allows a polymorphism to be maintained even if one of the traits is favored over a very long time compared to the other. The idea is that in order to obliquely transmit your trait, you don't need high fitness because you don't need to reproduce. You can transmit to offspring that are not your offspring. So in essence, non-vertical transmission protects the unfavored phenotype from natural selection. It goes against natural selection. And this is why it protects the polymorphism. Because in this case, there's actually one trait that is usually better, and still a polymorphism is maintained. We also looked at what happened if there's not just fluctuation in which trait is better, but there's also fluctuations in the transmission rate. Because you can think that some years there's lots of oblique transmission, and some years there's not much oblique transmission, right? Things that can limit the amount of oblique transmission can be a cold season, so you don't go out so much, a pandemic, right? That scares people to stay inside and not go out, and things like that. So this is the fluctuations in transmission rate and fluctuations in selection. And we find that if there's enough difference in selection, then a polymorphism can still be maintained even if there is a fluctuations in the transmission rate. We also looked at a case where there's two populations, one of them using a lot of oblique, one of them preferring to use vertical transmission, right? So one population is sort of conservative, you do what your parents did, and the other is more liberal. So you can do whatever you want, right? You can check what other people are doing and choose yourself. In this case, we also find that a protected polymorphism can occur. So here we see differences in migration between the two populations and differences in the transmission rate between the two populations. We find that polymorphism can occur if there is not much difference between the populations, so the difference in migration is small, as well as the difference in transmission, so you can get a polymorphism. But more interestingly, we find here a lot of cases of polymorphism. So the idea is that if vertical transmission occurs more often in the population that accepts more migrants, that will maintain polymorphism. Right? So if you go to a new population, but then you're using more vertical transmission, then your children will stay just like you. So you can bring in a new trait to the other population, and your children will still be like you, rather than sort of take the majority or the resident trait. Another element that we looked at is frequency-dependent transmission. That's the case where the probability that you use vertical or oblique transmission depends if your parent has the majority or the minority trait. And you can imagine scenarios in which, for example, a minority will make sure to socialize their children, right? To make them like the parents. Whereas if you're part of the majority, you don't need to socialize your children, right? You can send them out to the world and they'll get the same trait as you. In this case, we find that a negative dependence, exactly the case where if you're a minority, you invest more in doing vertical transmission. In these cases, we have, again, a polymorphism. So whatever initial frequency of the traits we start with on the y-axis, over time, there will be a stable frequency of the two traits, and a polymorphism will be maintained. So far I talked about the case of a polymorphism. What happens to the two traits? When can we get a stable coexistence of the two traits? It's also interesting to ask how oblique transmission affects the population mean fitness. And again, I'm talking about the fitness of the individuals, the biological fitness, right? The average number of children in the population, something like that. So what we did is we looked at different environmental periods, how often the environment changes, very rapidly or very slowly. And here I show you the transmission rate, so mostly vertical or mostly oblique. And we looked for the transmission rate that maximizes the population mean fitness over time. So it's like a population level trait, what's best for the population. We find that with fast changing environments, or even intermediate changing environments, every 20 generations is not that fast. Environmental change, it's not that fast for 20 generations. We find that in these cases, complete oblique transmission is best for the population and it maximizes the fitness of the population. And even with more slowly changing environments, it's best if most of the time, most of the individuals use oblique transmission. So they don't take their parents' trait, they just go out and find someone to copy. Okay, but the fact that it's good for the population in the long term does not mean it will evolve. We know about many cases in which good behavior doesn't evolve, right? The classical example is cooperation. So we also investigated evolutionary stability of vertical versus oblique transmission. And here we find something completely different. Again, this is the transmission rate versus the environmental period. If the environment changes every 1 or 2 generations, very rapidly changing environment, then complete oblique transmission will evolve and will be stable, evolutionary stable. That is, if a different strategy comes in, it cannot invade. However, if the environment doesn't change so rapidly, then the population will evolve to use mostly vertical transmission. And I remind you, what's best for the population was mostly oblique transmission, but what's evolutionary stable is mostly vertical. So this is sort of a tragedy of the commons. It's best if everybody learns from everybody, but everyone has a motivation to learn only from their parents. Right? And this is why we get this sort of a tragedy of the commons, or or a prisoner dilemma, or one of these cases, similar to one of these cases of cost of anarchy, or something like that. Okay. In the case of the frequency-dependent transmission, again, this is the idea where the chance that you use vertical or oblique transmission depends on the frequency of your parent trait. What we find is that selection will increase vertical transmission in offspring of parents with the favorable phenotype, and it will increase oblique transmission in offspring of the parents with the unfavorable phenotype. So the idea is that with low fitness, if your parents have low fitness, then they want to create individual differences. If your parents have high fitness, they want to make the child like its parent. And that makes sense, right? If you just think about it like that. If you have low fitness, you want your children to be different from you. If you have high fitness, you want your children to be similar to you. And similar effects have been shown for evolution of mutation rate, evolution of migration, recombination, individual learning. So there's a variety of processes that generate variation in the population that follow a similar rule. Low fitness, diverge. High fitness, stay the same. So to summarize, we find that evolution with oblique transmission is able to protect the polymorphism. It's able to hide the unfavorable phenotype from natural selection. And if it's able to do that or not depends both on the statistics of the fluctuations, both in the selection and the transmission. Regarding evolution of the transmission mode, we saw that oblique transmission has a long-term benefit for the population, but it can only evolve if the environment changes very rapidly. Although you can see that this evolutionary stable rate doesn't exactly go up to 1. So there's at least some oblique transmission, even if the environment changes more slowly. With that, I'd like to thank you for listening. There's some nice photos of the Interdisciplinary Center in Herzliya, where I am located. And if you have any questions, I'll be able to, or comments, I'll be able to hear them.
Thank you. Question?
So in this exciting talk, you presented this vertical and oblique transmission in cultural evolution under the assumption that biological evolution is essentially vertical here in these eukaryote populations. In prokaryotes, however, we have a whole lot of horizontal gene transfer, which is a different form of oblique transmission where this becomes part of the genome. How similar and how different are model outcomes in this case?
I think it depends on how exactly you model horizontal transmission. But I think that one important ingredient is how likely is it that a low fitness individual is still able to transmit. So here, fitness was mostly defined as the ability to reproduce. And if you cannot reproduce, you can still obliquely transmit. So for if you are thinking about prokaryotes, then you need to make some kind of a parallel to that. How likely is it that a cell transmits its, say, plasmid, but it's not unable to divide the cell? And I think there are some cases, maybe at least for transduction or things like that, that it's reasonable. Yeah.
Thank you. So one idea I just want to hear your opinion about in terms of how to test this. What about if we took, let's say, hunter-gatherers and farmers, right? Back in time, and you had population genetic data from hunter-gatherers and you had population genetic data from farmers across time in the same area. So those have genetic signatures that are distinct between the two, right? So if you then looked at, is there any correlation? I mean, what is spreading fastest? Is it actually the genetic signature or is it the lifestyle in terms of, you can say, you took archaeological sites, right? That, so to speak, resembles a hunter-gatherer versus a farming lifestyle. So, I'm just thinking that if you have the, the kind of parent offspring thing, well, then you should see that it was going with the same rate, right? While if it's actually the other way around, well, then you should see the spread of the farming happening way quicker than the genetic signature. Do you see what I'm saying?
No, that's really interesting. So two things that come to mind is, first, that everything I showed was about what happens within a single population, except for the one example with the two populations with migrants. And I think that a single population is probably, at least at some point, each population is either a farming or a pastoralist or gatherers or whatever, rather than a mixture. But and the other thing is that I'm really interested in seeing covariance between genetic data and cultural data, and that's a project that we recently started to think about how to do, and I'll be happy to talk about it more.
Sure.
We have time for a couple more questions, maybe from that side. Oh, in that case, I'll actually ask. So most traits are not just binary. It's not either horizontal or oblique. I mean, the ability to learn from others is also genetically determined to a degree. So do you take that into account?
So actually, definitely yes. Here, the fitness determining trait is binary, but the ability to learn from others is actually continuous. Because raw is from 0 to 1, it can be anything. The decision to take the fitness trait binary is a mathematical necessity to get to be able to get good, nice results. But the ability to learn is actually continuous here. I think that something interesting, you mentioned it, if it's genetically determined here, the ability to learn is vertically transmitted. And it's sort of what's called a phenotypic gambit. The ability to learn is itself vertically transmitted. What happens if you learn how to learn as well, right? So it's called social learning of social learning. And that would make the model more complicated, and we'll need to figure out what to do then. Yeah.
Okay. One more? Okay. Thank you. And okay, so our last speaker is Elad Schneidman from the Weizmann Institute, and he is involved in theoretical study of information transfer, and specifically he works on neural networks and also community behavior in animals.
Okay. First, thank you for inviting me, and thanks for staying for the kind of the last talk. I'm going to talk about a completely different kind of language. Actually, it's the machine code on which the usual language you think about runs, and this is the language of your brain. The language of your brain looks something like this. The neurons in your brain, as many of you know, talk to one another using a lot of small electrical signals, which we call spikes. And this is the summary of the language of about 100 neurons from the vertebrate retina, recorded by Ronen Segev in Ben-Gurion University. And so every horizontal line here is the activity of one neuron, and we put a dot whenever there was this electrical pulse that it sent to its neighbors. There's about 100 neurons here, so there are about 100 lines, and there's about 30 seconds of response. And this is the language by which the retina, in this case, sends all the visual information to the brain. And what we would like to be able to do is to read this language. And what I'm going to tell you about today are 2 steps towards being able to read this. The first set of questions are going to be mostly about what can we say about the rules of this language? What are the rules of the vocabulary? And which is mostly talking about which combinations of activity patterns of neurons are valid words in this language. And the other is going to be about how could we, and maybe even the brain, make sense of these patterns. In particular, how can it deal with things that it has never seen before? And a little bit maybe at the end about how the brain could really actually learn to read this is kind of a bit of a different of how we might be thinking about this. And that's kind of an issue of how your brain can learn and generalize. So the first reason why this is a hard problem to make sense of is the fact that your brain seems to be made of components that are not as reliable as you might think they are. If you actually present some kind of stimulus to a neuron and you record its activity, you'll get these sequences of spikes from it. But if you actually repeat the same stimulus over and over again, you get different variations of this thing, which is a reflection of the fact that the internal language of your brain seems to be probabilistic. So there's variability, and this variability is something that's built into the system, and your brain needs to deal with it. And what it means for us is that we need to describe this language in probabilistic terms. So I'm going to talk a lot about the probability of observing a particular pattern or the frequency with which you might see particular things. The other problem, which is even much more demanding, is the fact that the space of the patterns here is huge. We know that these are the fundamental symbols of the language, these electrical spikes. They're common in almost every animal you've ever encountered. And this is kind of the universal letters of the language. The question of how does the brain weave them together to create meaningful words, this is the kind of the key problem. Because if we look at even just a very short snippet in time, and I just ask out of these 100 neurons that I'm showing you which one was silent and which one was active, there's 2 to the 100 possible patterns. That's a painfully large number. And so if we are to make any sense of how this language is built, it's not going to be by running a very long experiment. We'll never see all of these. We need to figure out something about the rules of the game. And so to try and make a sense of the rules of the game, the obvious question you might ask is, well, what's the relation between what all these neurons are doing? And it's somewhat surprising that almost everywhere you look at in the brain, even among neurons that seem to be doing similar things, the typical correlation between them is actually very weak, on the order of a few percent. If you actually ask how much information do neurons convey about external stimulus, and I'll show you an example again from the retina, and these are a summary of data from many experiments done in Michael Berry's lab in Princeton, recording from the retina, responding to different movies. This is a plot of a lot of neurons summarized together. Every dot here is one pair of neurons. The color of the dot tells you something about the kind of natural movie that this particular retina saw. This is the distance between the neurons, and this is in kind of fractional units, how redundant is the information that one neuron carries about the world versus the other. So if you look at one neuron and its neighbor, how much do they share in terms of the information they carry? And while there are some cells that have a lot of redundancy between them, the typical answer is that cells are very weakly redundant. So they seem to be kind of independent from one another. And this seems like to be like maybe a principle of how these things might be built. If the cells are really decorrelated from one another in explaining what's happening in the world, then this seems to be a very good idea if you wanted to convey a lot of information. The brain needs to work under a lot of constraints in terms of energy and space and time. So if you actually were to make the cells decorrelated from one another and everyone is doing something else, that will be maximizing the capacity of your brain to convey information. Nobody is offended when you suggest their brain is optimal. Everybody's cool with that idea. There's two problems with this. One is that you want redundancy for two reasons. One, this is the thing that actually lets you overcome the noise that I just told you that exists in your brain. And the other is that you want this redundancy to actually be able to learn from examples. And so this seems a little weird to us that these correlations are so weak, and so we went to look at what happens if you go beyond pairs. So we saw that it's weak at the level of pairs. If we look at something what happens at the level of of groups, so this is now zooming in here on a group of 10 cells, and I'm zooming up on time, so every one of these green boxes is 20 milliseconds long, and I'm going to put 1 whenever a neuron was active and 0 when it was silent, so I get this set of binary patterns. And now I'm going to ask how correlated are these patterns. Basically, is the probability of observing a particular pattern just the product of what every neuron is doing, where x would be either 1 or 0. That's the probability that the neuron was active. So it turns out that the neurons are extremely correlated. If you look at this group of 10 cells, this is an example from one such experiment. Every one of these dots is a binary pattern like this. The x-axis is the frequency that you actually see that in the experiment. So this is the real way the retina uses them to convey things about the world. The y-axis is the prediction of what would happen if the cells were really independent. And the black line is the equality, which tells you that there's orders of magnitude mismatches here. My favorite is the pattern that occurs once a minute, and independence would predict that it would occur once every few years. So with this level of mismatch, one of the obvious things to ask is, where is this coming from? And what we figured is that it's true that the typical correlation is weak. So if you think about two neurons and you say, well, there's a relation between this blue neuron over here and its neighbor in black, and there's a very weak correlation between them, why would that even matter? Well, it turns out that it's true that the typical correlation is weak, but the blue neuron has a lot of friends. And so if it's weakly coupled to a lot of neurons, that might be a completely different game, in particular if you think about the other neurons that have its set of friends. So we try to ask, well, if you take into account all these weak relations between individual pairs, what's the social structure of all of these working together? And to try and make sense of this, basically solving this jigsaw puzzle of all these weak pair relations, we use the trick from statistical physics to try and talk about the minimal way to combine all of these things together. This is an idea called the maximum entropy distribution, which is a principal way to build a description of something given a particular observation, in our case, what the neurons are doing individually and what's the correlations between them. And it turns out, luckily, that this particular way of asking the question has a unique mathematical answer that has the following form. So the probability of observing a particular pattern over this group of cells is an exponential distribution that has two sets of parameters, one set of parameters for every neuron and one parameter for every pair. And basically, this exponential distributions that the physicists in the crowd know as an Ising model, the computer scientists know as the Markov random fields, the statisticians know as log linear models, and it rose by any other name would still be an exponential model. And so what we get when we use this kind of model is that this does a remarkably good job of predicting the frequency of words in this language. So this is the same data from before. The blue dots are the prediction of the model that assumes that the cells were independent. If we take into account this set of all these collective effect of all these weak pairwise relations, this is the red dots over here. This is the prediction for each one of these patterns by using the model that took into account all the collective effect of all these weak things. And you see this sits very nicely on the line, and the scatter over here is actually within the error bar, so that's actually almost as good as you can get. And this has been seen in many, many systems ever since we started playing with this. So then you can actually extend this and say, okay, it seems like we found some principle of how these large vocabularies are built. We can go and ask, what if we look at sequences in time of many more neurons? So this is for tens of neurons. And we can actually take into account the correlations between cells at particular points in time, over points in time. This is kind of a large set of things you might take into account in terms of dependencies. And then you get up with this a little bit scary looking model which is there to remind me to tell you that this is just technically very hard to build, but once you do this and the dust settles, it actually works remarkably well. So this is application of this to data from the prefrontal cortex of a monkey that sits in front of a screen and sees dots moving on that screen, and it needs to do a classification task of how the dots were moving. And this is an example of the spikes coming from 100 and something of its neurons responding or being active while the animal is making the decision. So it gets the stimulus somewhere over here, and then it observes the dots and thinks about it, and then we look at different segments of this task, which we color here with different colors. And so when we build this model of the vocabulary, what we figured that when we look at these different parts of the task, in all of them, while there are big differences in the individual patterns that go on, the effect of the correlations is extremely strong. So this is the summary of the likelihood ratio between of the two models, one that takes correlations into account and the other that doesn't. And we see that the combined effect of all these seemingly weak correlations at the level of tens of neurons working in the cortex of a monkey creates orders of magnitude differences. So this ranges from 10 to the 5 to 10 to the 9. It means that nothing that actually happens in the brain would have happened if the cells were independent, if you could ignore these weak correlations. So there's a collective effect of this community that creates a super strongly correlated language for everybody else down the road in the brain to listen to. You can go and ask what happens if you go even in larger populations, which is what we've been doing, and then it turns out that you actually need to go beyond pairs, which seems to be a very insurmountable mountain when you think about it, because if you need to take triplets or quadruplets into account, then the number of things you need to worry about becomes combinatorially painful. But then it turns out that you can actually use something that we've learned from looking at natural languages, which is let's look at the actual vocabulary. So if you look at the patterns that we see from these 100 cells, and we order them according to how often we see them, and so the x-axis is just every dot here is one pattern, this is its ranking, and this is how often you see it, we get something that looks very much like the zip flaw that you see in the usage of natural languages. And this is true both for looking at spatial patterns and spatial temporal patterns of the code. And so what we figured is that maybe we can use the fact that the system behaves like this to actually anchor ourselves in trying to learn something about this code only from the very frequent words that we see. And this allowed us to actually identify, instead of thinking about all the possible dependencies between cells, that there's actually a very sparse set of high-order relations between neurons that actually governs this language. And when we actually do that, we can identify a set of dependencies between the cells. This is an example of this. Every dot in this plot is one neuron, and the link here denotes the strength of the dependency between them. This is the map of pairwise relations, triple-wise relations, and quadruplets. And these are the ones we learned only from the very common words in this language. So we use the frequent words to actually try and make sense of things. And it turns out when you do that, you actually end up with a very small set relatively to the full thing you might have considered of a few hundreds of pairs and triplets and quadruplets. You don't even need all the pairs. And when you do that, you can build models which are extremely accurate. So this is a summary of one of these experiments. This is 3 versions of trying to predict the code. Every dot in one of these plots is the one particular word. This is how often you see it in the experiment. This is the agreement between the model and the data in log units. So if the model was good, everything would be in 0. The blue funnel here is sampling noise confidence intervals. So everything within the blue funnel is kosher. And if you actually take the independent model, this is really bad. The pairwise model is doing much better. But if we have this sparse set of high-order terms, we can actually predict individual pattern over the language of 100 cells, basically as well as doing the experiment again. So we identify this very sparse set of things govern the collective behavior of this language. And with that, we kind of felt that if we have a good handle on what are the valid patterns in this language, what are the words, maybe it's time to ask what do they actually mean. So how can we interpret the code? And maybe this will tell us also something about how the brain might do this. Because if you look at these patterns, not at the level of 5 or 10 or even 50 neurons, but you think about what happens for, let's say, 1,000 neurons, no pattern will repeat itself. This sounds like a stupid Zen thing. You never cross the same river twice. The neurons in your brain will never say the exact same thing, even at the level of a few hundred cells. Your retina will never send the same pattern down the road. So your brain will have to always deal with something that it has never seen before, and it would have to generalize in some way about what this might mean. Now, we have a lot of intuition about how we should think about generalizing from patterns like this, right? And the obvious thing to look at is to think of some version of edit distance metrics. So this is kind of an example of that. If you think about the one set of spikes in the top here in A and the other one in B, you might ask yourself, what is the minimal set of operations I need to get from one sequence to the other? We've all done this many times, and it's frequent in many places, in particular because it's easy to compute and it has a clear answer. The problem, of course, is that it's not clear that the brain actually took that class. I mean, it's not clear that why it would use this way of representing things and whether this is the right metric to use. So we thought maybe we shouldn't guess what the brain is doing, maybe we should learn what the brain is doing, and so we're going to try and learn a semantic map on the patterns of this language. We took experiments in which the same stimulus was repeated many, many times, so this is one example of what happens when you show the same movie. Everything that will be purple from now on will be an artificial movie that was shown to the retina, again in Ronen Segev's lab at Ben-Gurion. The thing on the right is going to be the responses of the same neurons, but this time to a natural movie that recorded walking in a forest. And in any one of these repeats, this will be now the activity. We're going to look at a particular group of 20 neurons as an example to look at how similar or variant the thing is. And what we figured is that the way to make sense of what controls this language and how you could generalize is to figure out something about the nature of the encoding and the level of the noise in the system. So, and if we actually look at what happens over many, many repeats, and I focus on one particular point in time along the movie over the repeats, this will be the particular pattern over the 600 and something repetitions. So you see this black patterns, this will be the variance on a thing that the system actually used. And what we want to do is in trying to make sense of what are basically synonyms in this language, is to steal an old idea from actual language processing. So this goes back to distribution clustering of English by Fernando Pereira and his collaborators, or the young people in the ground will know this as Amazon's people who bought this book also like this book. And so in a sense, I'm going to ask about two particular words in this language and ask how similar they are, not by assuming how you should measure the overlap, if these are the pattern which, the 4th and the 9th and the 12th neuron spiked or something like that. I'm actually going to look back and ask how these words were used to encode the movie. So I'm going to look at the distribution over the movie segments, given that I've observed a particular word. So what do I know about which frame in the movie was on if I know that I saw this particular neural response? And so I'm going to measure the overlap between these two distributions as a measure of how similar these words are. Because if they mean the same thing, they're going to be used roughly at the same times along the movie. So we're going to measure that by the overlap of these two distributions. So we did that for many thousands of words that we saw in one such experiment, and there's a map now on the left again for an artificial movie, on the right for a natural movie, and we have thousands and thousands of words, and every entry in this matrix is this measure of how overlapping these distributions are, namely whether these words were used at similar times, and this is ranges between 0 and 1 in some normalized units to get a sense of the overlap. So 1 would be that they're completely used at completely different times, and 0 means that they're very similar. Now I have this huge map of all the pairwise relations between all the words. I need to show it to you somehow. I'm plotting some version of this here, which is when I've ordered the words here along the axis in a particular way that I like, namely how active were the neurons in this particular segment. This doesn't show you much, which tells you, again, you shouldn't rely on your intuition, but if you cluster this thing, it's clear that there's very clear structure. So now the words are ordered in a way that will reflect the fact that who's similar to whom, and you see that you will get this block diagonal structures, which is especially nice for the natural movies. All these patterns are very close to one another in terms of when they're being used and very far from everything else. And if you actually tried one of the common syntactic structures like a Hamming distance, this is the clustering result of Hamming. So it gives you basically nothing. So now you ask yourself, okay, so how can I make sense of the way this code is built? What does this block diagonal structure mean? So what we did was say, let's take all the words and try and do some low-dimensional embedding to get a feeling for the space of words. So we're going to use 3D because this is the best we can plot, of course. And then I'm going to put them in space and put an ellipsoid around all the words that belong to the same cluster. And what we got, to our surprise, is that these are very clean, separated groups. So these words are actually inhabit a space in which it's very easy to tell apart, of course, which cluster you belong to. And if you ask yourself, why would that be the case, this seems very similar to the way engineers actually build codes. So going back to the fundamental ideas of information theory about what should you do when you want to send information to someone over a noisy channel, we say, well, I'm going to pick my code words in the space of possible patterns in such a way that if there's noise, even the noisy version is going to be distinguishable from other things. And that's exactly what we see. So if you actually ask, what are the things that you actually see in these different clusters? These are kind of examples of the patterns that belong to the same cluster. So you can see, for example, on the one over here, these things, the vertical lines look like variations on a theme. This is the average of this thing, which tells you that some neurons must be active or silent for this word to be a member of these clusters. But there's a lot of gray stuff in here, which means that there's a lot of variation. And so we ask, can we actually think further about how the brain could use or interpret these kind of structures? What should I do when I see a pattern that I've never seen before? And the point is that if you think about these clusters, it turns out that you can actually maybe omit the details of the pattern and just say something about which cluster this pattern belonged to. So here's one example when we took what we learned from one movie, went to another movie, showed it to the retina, got a set of responses, and then for every one of the patterns, this is a cartoon, of course, I'm actually trying to assign it to which cluster I think it belongs to. So these colors designate the different clusters. And now I'm going to ask, if I asked you about the movie just from what I know from looking at the neurons, so if I try to decode the movie or understand something about the movie by knowing the detailed spiking patterns of the neurons, versus the case where all I tell you that this was a pattern that belonged to the red class or the blue class or cluster or one of the other ones, how much would I know? And this is the summary of these results. When I'm actually plotting how much information you retain about the movie, if I just tell you the pattern, the cluster that a pattern belonged to versus the actual pattern. And this is we show this as a function of the number of clusters we use. And so you see that by the time we got about 200 clusters, and this is the green curve over here, we actually know about 90% of the information there is to know about the movie from these neurons. So with about 200, so this code book is organized in something that you can think of as about 200 clusters, semantic clusters, with which I can reconstruct almost everything there is to know about the movie. For reference, I'm showing what we get from this Hamming thing, and to get to 90%, I need to have thousands and thousands of clusters, which is basically the set of the data that we have. So we can actually use that to go and decode new movies and ask what happens if I see a particular pattern that I've never seen before, which is what the brain needs to do all the time. And from this set of structure of the cluster, identify for a new pattern which cluster it belongs to. And this is an example of how well we can decode the actual distribution of a stimuli from one observed pattern to another, which works remarkably well. And so just to sum up, what I've tried to show you is that the language of your brain is built by a principle of large, collective effect of a lot of weakly coupled things. So there's a collective organization in which none of the individual members is strongly coupled to anybody else in particular. It creates this, you can think of your favorite political metaphor of this structure of the sharing thing between everybody. But this sparse set is such also that it's relatively easy to learn because the actual number of things that govern these organizations is not that big. So you don't need an exponential or combinatorial number even of things to know. You need to figure out what they are, and they are relatively easy to learn, so it seems. So it seems that the brain has picked a language that is relatively easy for us to learn, which probably means it's relatively for another set of neurons to learn. It seems like it's organized in semantic clusters, which are very well separated from one another. Again, it makes it very easy to to decode without making mistakes, even for new things. And what we think this actually suggests is that this whole structure of the way things are coded is built exactly to overcome the main thing you don't know when you want to tell someone else something, which is how smart are they? So the main issue is that you can create yourself your own wonderful language and structures. It's worthless if your listener doesn't know how to read it. And so it seems that the brain is building languages or code books that are relatively easy to learn to decode, probably because it cannot be know for certain how smart is the neurons down the road that's going to listen to it. So that's the story. I want to thank the people involved. This is kind of the lab, and the people that did the work that I described today are in bold font. This is Elad Galmoren, Einat, and Udi, and Ori, and the other people that collaborated, and the people who gave us money. And thank you for your time.
Thank you. So maybe from this side, questions?
I've killed them all.
Can you say a couple of words about the nature of the movies you showed?
So these were natural movies in the sense that we actually we did different versions. One was to go in the forest with a camera and kind of imitate the way we would walk slowly in the forest and get the different things. There were other movies we used which were actually looking at a set of fish swimming in a tank. So this is actually a natural movement that are kind of natural, at least for the salamanders when we looked at them. There were other things that had to do with optical flow. So we actually had small things, small robots running around the woods. But these are all different versions of what would seem like a sensible natural statistics of how the visual world would look for an observer. Yes?
Is there any way to compare between different animals? Two animals of the same species?
Oh.
Or the same animal twice?
Okay, so Ofer was asking if is there a way to compare animals. So this is a slide I took out because I didn't think I have time, but thank you for the question. I'll give you the money later. We didn't do it in this particular animal because this is too complicated. It's not clear how to map one animal's retina to the other when you have many, many hundreds and thousands of neurons. We did ask in another experiment what happens if you look at flies. So it turns out that if you look at the visual system of flies, there's a very clear bottleneck of neurons that report motion. And so you can find a particular neuron called H1 because this is the neuron that responds when there's large things moving, horizontal moving in the field. So we actually went and asked this question of can we compare the neural codes of different animals? And the answer is that the diversity is unbelievably large. So you can get the set of patterns is very different. The amount of information can be different by a factor of 3 or 4. And then you can ask yourself, is the fact that we have different neural codes and different information content in different animals, is it because one is smarter than the other, but this is something that requires a very different kind of experiment, which I'd love to be able to do.
So, Elad?
Yes.
Ciao. Do you
Which
have
way?
Here.
Ah.
So do you have a sense that the richness of the language, your semantics, scales up with the content of the movies that you have shown?
Yeah. So it seems that so we don't have enough movies or enough neurons to record to give a conclusive answer. It seems like the less natural the movie and more artificial it is. I mean, this is more kind of white noise that we showed. It seems that the vocabulary is actually richer when you describe these random fields of things moving. In terms of how many neurons, this scales up in a way that must be leveling off at some way, and this has been something we've been looking at. It's clear that of the potential space of patterns that it could use, these languages seem to be very, very compressed in terms of how rich they are. And I think this is exactly the structure of clusters, is one where you can relatively easily figure out something about a new word and kind of balance capacity with robustness.
talking about the comparing different animals. Were you talking about different species or about different animals of the same species?
Yes. So we did this twice. We did this with different flies that were exactly from the same species, and this variance was there whether they actually grew in the same environment or in different environments. We actually played with that. The code didn't seem to care that much about it. And then we took another species that grew in different conditions. It seems like there are pretty properties which are retained for individual species. Not surprisingly, maybe it's not clear that I can connect your brain to another species and you immediately know what's going on, but maybe next time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Elad. And now to something completely different, and as if it wasn't the motto for the entire day. So first of all, I must say deep thanks to the two signers that we have here. Who I think astonish every one of us. Be honest, each and every one of us can float once in a while in a talk, but they can't. That's remarkable. Thank you. And now it's a pleasure to introduce an artist, Victoria Chana from Israel, for an artistic show that I think lies in some interesting place between the arts and language and music. Victoria is a very special artist. She grew up in an Orthodox family, a Jewish Orthodox family in Israel. She developed. She comes from the Jewish tradition of literary, religious literature. She created in her arts her unique style, unique language, unique